Videos like this are made possible by the generous support of patrons like Lunokhod the Fox. Thanks, Luna. Hello, Penguinauts, I'm the Beardy Penguin, and welcome back to For All Kerbalkind, kicking off today's episode with Lunokhod 6 as it's exploring Mare Imbrium. Now, it's on its way over to Mare Tranquillitatis, which is going to be its rendezvous point with a future crewed mission. Of course, someone has to come and pick up all of those surface samples it's been collecting across the near side of the moon, but on its way there, it's encountered a relic of our space program's past. This is Luna 8, which landed here on the 10th of November 1961, mere hours after the USA's Mayflower lander very, very narrowly second to soft landing on the moon, which I thought was a fun little comparison of how much our technology has advanced in the intervening 6 years. Heading on over to Salyut 4, a little bit closer to home, our Progress resupply vehicle that we launched in the previous episode needs to head back to Earth. And by head back to Earth, I mean burn up in the atmosphere. It doesn't have any parachutes or anything, it's not returning any experiments. We just need to free up the berth as we want to rotate the crew. We have a contract to rotate the crew, in fact, and their supplies are getting a little low, so we need a resupply, we need a new crew as they're starting to get a little bit stressed out up there, nowhere near the levels of Regatka. We're not going to put any other crew through that kind of stress ever again, hopefully. But we get a nice little fireworks show as Progress re-enters the atmosphere shortly before we launch Soyuz 14. And we have a couple of newcomers on this flight. It's commanded by Ilgiz, who of course was named by Darth Malachor. He's from the Russian SSR. He's visited some of our Almaz stations, but we have two new intercosmos Kerbals, Hendrik, named by the patron of the same name, who is from the German Democratic Republic, and Unkoloso Kerman, named by Mad Science Minutes, who is from Zambia. That's right, he's named after Edward Unkoloso, founder of the Zambia National Academy of Science, who is famous for his quote-unquote space program. It was really a big publicity stunt, for his Afronauts, as they were jokingly named, were supposedly going to land on Mars ahead of the rest of the world. It's a really fun little story if you don't know about it, but in this timeline it seems as if Edward Unkoloso, or Unkoloso Kerman as he is known here, was successful in his dream as he has negotiated passage aboard Soyuz 14 and is going to be spending a few months aboard Salyut 4. So it's becoming a bit of a bastion of international collaboration. I'd really like to send an astronaut from the European Space Agency up here, perhaps in the next episode. I think that could be quite a bit of fun, because they don't have their own crew launch capability just yet. They're getting close though, as I believe the Ariane is capable of hefting a spacecraft containing at least one Kerbal into orbit. They definitely have the technology, it's just whether or not they have the funding to do that just yet, but it will only be another year or so, I think, until they manage that themselves. So let's see if we can squeeze some money out of them before they have the capability to launch their own Kerbals. Of course, after the crew handover, we're sending Soyuz 13 back to the Earth, leaving Salyut 4 in the capable hands of its new crew. Alexei's actually been up in space for a while. If you remember, he didn't actually go home on the last Soyuz. He's been there for 2 crew rotations. We sent some intercosmos Kerbals up for a little bit of a shorter stay, but I think it's time to bring him home. And also, the contract doesn't actually allow for intercosmos-esque changeovers. The contract is for returning the entire crew and replacing the entire crew. It doesn't provide a huge amount of funding, but in these post-moon landing days, we need to take all the funding we can get. Back up in the space station, Unkoloso and Hendrik perform a routine spacewalk, and Unkoloso enjoys it maybe a little bit too much. Seeing the new country flag patches on the left shoulder of our Kerbals now in all of their glory. I think it makes them a little easier to distinguish when they've got their sun visors down. Now, heading on over to the lunar launch pad at Baikonur, this is Rodina 8. Yes, after our successful launch of the N2 in the previous episode, it's time to slap a crew on top of it. It is time to return to the moon with a vastly improved lunar complex over the L3 complex with the, I don't want to say dangerous, but yeah, the LK is a bit of a ramshackle way of landing someone on the moon, and of course it's not a sustainable program because it can only carry one crew member and it can only support them for about a day, and long-term exploration contracts now require crews to be there for multiple days and be able to carry multiple crew members. So we needed a heavier launch vehicle, which we now have, so we have a new and improved lunar complex. A lot of people asked about the main engines on that first stage. Of course, I spent most of the previous episode talking about the NK-15 VM, but these engines are 6 RD-116s, which are actually kerosene variants of the RD-270, the only full-flow staged combustion cycle engine ever tested before, of course, SpaceX's Raptor engine today, which is now the only full-flow staged combustion cycle engine to have flown. But these engines were the largest single-chamber engines in the Soviet Union. They were actually designed and tested running toxic hypergolic propellants, UDMH and NTO, but the idea of adapting them for Keralox was briefly explored, so we've got some alt-hist variants of them there. Don't worry, we will be using the toxic fuels on a future UR700 and perhaps even the ultra-toxic pentaborane fuels, which will be a bit of fun. We do have some ignition failures on our NK-15 VMs, but after that, our second stage continues not quite without a hitch. We do get another thrust loss, and then the third stage has a few more problems. We have yet another ignition failure, and although we managed to correct it, while I'm trying to organize a nice beautiful cinematic shot, we have a permanent shutdown. There's no way to counteract this other than to shut down the opposing engine. Now thankfully these engines are powerful enough and efficient enough, with the rocket being capable of hefting something 20 tons heavier than this lunar complex. We are able to compensate after doing a little backflip there. But we can't afford to lose any more engines if we're going to get into orbit with our lowered thrust-to-weight ratio. Unfortunately, just as I'm getting said cinematic shot that I was preparing for, well, we don't quite lose another engine, but we have a performance loss. A new Kerbal, commander of this mission, the Peter Kerman, takes the manual controls, manages to restore control to the rocket after yet another backflip, and uses the gimbal of the engines to compensate for the lowered performance of one of those outer engines. I am honestly shocked that we managed to maintain control of this and somehow managed to actually get into orbit. After managing to stabilize, and once I know that we're actually going to safely get into orbit, I do shut down those outer engines, as the lower performance does actually also reduce the specific impulse. So we're much better off just using that single core engine that's still operating at peak efficiency. And there we have it. By the skin of our teeth, we managed to get Rodina 8 into low Earth orbit. It really was very close. After multiple backflips, performance losses, and engine losses, I really did think we were going to have to abort, but somehow we managed to pull it off. Really, it's thanks to those huge delta V margins that we have on this rocket being a little bit overbuilt for this, as of course I wanted it to be future-proof in case we want to expand the payloads that we send to the moon in the future. As mentioned, we have a newcomer on this flight, Nepeta, named by the patron of the same name, and they're from the Estonian SSR, and they will be commanding Rodina 8. Our Soyuz pilot is Marko, named by NX74656, who's from the Lithuanian SSR, and we actually have an intercosmos Kerbal, Joanna, named by Joseph793, who's from the German Democratic Republic, and they are a scientist, because it's actually quite important to take scientists down to the surface of the moon now that we have an extra slot in our 2 Kerbal lander, because we now have access to the deep surface sample, which only scientists can perform, at least in our For All Kerbalkind rules. And so we need to take them down to the surface to get the extra 45 science that that surface sample provides. Just performing our translunar injection there, and now we need to copy a bit of the United States' homework as we perform a transposition and docking maneuver. We actually have proper docking apparatus that's more than just a grappling hook and a grate, because we have the payload capacity. The whole reason why there's no docking tunnel between the Soyuz LOK and the LK is not because the Soviets couldn't build one, it's just because there just simply wasn't enough mass budget for it. With the Hydrolox second and third stages on the launch vehicle and this maneuver, it is looking a little bit similar to Apollo, but we're simply taking what we know works, and there are still some notable differences in the flight profile, which you'll see throughout. You can see there the LEK lander in all of its glory. It's very loosely based off of the LEK lander, which was a two-person LK concept in reality, but there aren't really anything more than a few vague sketches to go off of. So I just designed it to fit within the payload fairing and look very similar to the Soyuz, except of course it's adapted for landing on the surface of the moon. We have that trusty block day transfer stage at the bottom there, which will be breaking us into orbit around the moon and performing the first part of the descent to the surface. The LEK doesn't actually need block day to descend to the surface, it can do it entirely on its own, but we are going to use a bit of the fuel just so we have a lot of delta V to look for a landing site, as of course these missions are potentially going to be carrying more cargo to the moon in the future and are going to be doing precisely targeted landings, which do require a bunch of extra fuel. This first one though is another targeted moon landing contract similar to what we completed with Rodina 8, where we simply have to land in a biome. So it's a nice little dress rehearsal for future contracts where we're going to have to land near a specific spacecraft, i.e. Lunokhod 6, and then explore a few different waypoints. Now I'm going to have a little chat about the NK15 VM, because I mentioned in the previous episode that it annoys the RP1 devs a lot when people use it, and I thought that was simply because it's an alternate history engine that didn't exist. No, it turns out it really annoys them because its performance is just way too good. So I do want to let you guys know that I actually went and changed it. I had a little look at the performance and it's better than the RD0120 engine, which is essentially the Soviets equivalent of the space shuttle main engine, which is obviously insane to have in the 1960s. So I actually pulled out my old spacecraft propulsion lecture notes and derived the performance of the NK15 VM from first principles, which led to a theoretical maximum performance of basically the performance it already had. So I think that's probably the approach that the mod author took. 100% combustion efficiency and isentropic flow, which doesn't happen in reality. I decided to take the performance of the RD0120, which is a real engine that was flown, and then interpolate it using the NK15V's engine data, which of course was a real engine, which the NK15VM is based on. So I took its chamber pressure and its area ratio and used that to interpolate the thrust and the specific impulse of that engine. So it's gone from a thrust in vacuum of about 2,000 kilonewtons to about 1,300 kilonewtons, and a specific impulse of 455 seconds to 445 seconds. I also tweaked the reliability, so the starting reliability is a bit lower and the final reliability is a bit higher, which is probably why we had quite so many engine failures after a perfect launch in the previous episode. And I also changed the model because for some reason it was using the NK33 model instead of the actual NK15V model, which is available, which I think looks a lot better. So hopefully that will satisfy those of you in the comments that absolutely despise the NK15VM as it previously existed. I think that's a much more reasonable engine, which the Soviets could have developed in this time period. I didn't want to get rid of it entirely because it fills a very important niche in the progression, and I think they would be capable of building it and would have built something similar if the space race had not ended. They would have had a need for a heavy lift Hydrolox upper stage engine. Regardless, let's head back to Rodina 8 as we are beginning our approach down into Mare Nectaris, which is our planned landing site. It did require us to enter quite an inclined orbit of the moon, which is going to cause us some problems later, as of course we have to stay on the surface for 2 days to fulfill our contract, which means that the moon is going to rotate under the orbit, and we're going to have quite a hefty inclination change if we want to get back to the Soyuz. But that's a problem for later. Right now, we just need to land on the surface. Now, better taking manual control, you can see we're actually using two engines, the RD858 and the RD859, which was just a backup engine on the original LK, as we need the thrust to weight ratio. But we can drop the RD859 on our final approach, so we have much finer control over our final descent. We do have to suddenly veer over so we avoid hitting some rocks, which would have toppled the lander as they have collisions, but thankfully we managed to narrowly avoid them, land next to the cluster, fire our braking thrusters, and there we have it. We have landed in Mare Nectaris. Nepeta is the first out of the LEK and to set foot onto the surface with the shiny new gold sun visor down, and you can see the Estonian SSR flag on her shoulder there. It's actually a really cool flag. It's like the flag of the USSR but with the waves, which so obviously represent the Baltic Sea, which is also important to Estonia. Joanna there proudly wearing the flag of the German Democratic Republic on her shoulder. Nepeta, of course, being the USSR national, has to be first and has to be the one to plant the flag, although Joanna is here as she is a geologist and, well, we want to take full advantage of her expertise exploring this region. Kind of Apollo 15-esque, just minus the lunar rover. The lunar rover is going to be on the next crewed mission when we rendezvous with Lunokhod 6 and collect its surface samples. We don't have a cargo bay that we could store it in on the LEK. We'd have to strap something of the same mass to the other side. So let me know if you have any ideas as to what that could actually be. Joanna manages to make a game out of using the lower lunar gravity to belly flop up onto the nearby boulders. Of course, Nepeta is not one to shy away from a challenge and decides to prove that she's able to do so without belly flopping directly onto her face. And sure enough, Joanna has to concede. After taking a couple of hours completing the deep surface sample that we brought Joanna Kerbal along to complete, it's time to get back into the LEK. Although they probably will conduct a couple of other EVAs during the 2 days that they're staying on the lunar surface, but we daren't stay any longer than that because, as previously mentioned, the longer we stay, the more expensive it gets to reach the Soyuz again, unless we plan on staying here for an entire month, which the LEK definitely does not have the capacity to support 2 Kerbals for. So it's time to think about heading on home. Marco is of course waiting up in orbit and is ready to rendezvous with them, perhaps even change his own orbit if they run out of propellant. And it's because of this arrangement with the lunar orbit rendezvous that I am determined to do an LK 700 on the UR 700. Not for a little while yet. I want to get my money's worth out of the N2 and this upgraded lunar complex, but I think once we have a lunar base, it's going to be a huge faff to do all the lunar orbit rendezvous, the transposition and docking and everything in order to send crews to it and support it. And I don't want to be leaving a Kerbal in an orbiting spacecraft for 6 months at a time while other Kerbals are on the surface. I would like all the Kerbals to land at the base and then stay there for 6 months to a year, then it'll get in and head straight back. So a direct ascent mission profile makes a lot of sense in that case. So I think an LK 700, which was actually quite a mature concept, launched on a UR 700, perhaps the Keralox variant of the RD270, or maybe just not the pentaborane one, maybe just the normal UR 700 if we prove it to be safe enough. I think that would be pretty cool. I think that's almost certainly going to be the launch vehicle and the lander that we use to support a base. It's much, much better suited for it. But it's also way bigger and way more expensive, so we do not need it for this second phase of lunar exploration. But once we are supporting a base, really just for my own sanity in making the episodes, I need something that's a lot simpler and a lot faster to deploy crew to the surface of the moon, which is the main draw of the LK700 UR700 system. It just reduces the complexity. Yeah, it's a huge mega rocket, but it actually has so fewer points of failure. There are a lot of people who argue that if they pursued the UR700 LK700 direct descent design, the Soviets might have landed on the moon. They certainly wouldn't have beaten the US to the moon. There is no timeline in which the Soviets beat the US to the moon, and that is a hot take for some reason, but there simply is no world in which the Soviet government actually gives it the funding it needs and the various design bureaus don't compete. I mean, Glushko got Korolev sent to a gulag. They were never going to be friends. They were never going to collaborate, right? But that would be an interesting video, I think, to make. Like, what if the Soviets did land on the moon? Perhaps what if the N1 had worked, or if the UR700 worked? What if they did actually land on the moon? They wouldn't have got there first, but what if we did then still have some level of competition there? Because of course they were still trying to land people on the moon even after Apollo 11. They didn't just throw in the towel. You had a few more launches of the N1 after that. And well, the fourth launch of the N1 got so close to working, perhaps could have even worked if ground control had reacted a little faster when the first stage caught fire and fired the second stage a little earlier. I think a fifth launch may well have worked. People like to laugh at the N1 and go, silly Russians, look at all those engines launching in such a ridiculous mega rocket without testing it on the ground. How crazy can you be? But I mean, people don't seem to have the same arguments towards SpaceX doing very similar stuff, just blowing up super heavy booster after super heavy booster. Obviously, it's not directly comparable. SpaceX do static fires, which really is the thing that doomed the N1. They couldn't test fire each engine before mounting it onto the rocket, but that was fixed in later versions of those engines. The NK-33 could be test fired. So later versions of the M1, if it just had a bit more time, a bit more funding, or had just been started earlier. People forget that Kennedy gave the "We Choose to Go to the Moon" speech in 1962. Work didn't even begin on the Soviet moon program until 1964. There was so much lost time, and it had 1/10 the budget of the Apollo program, and they still managed to build a rocket that almost worked. It's a minor miracle they even managed that. But it is, of course, very interesting to see this timeline in which those rockets did work, even if they did kill a couple of Kerbals along the way. Ditching the lander there, deorbiting it into the surface of the moon. We don't want to create lunar space junk or have those pesky Americans get their grubby mitts on it. They actually have a space station around the moon now, so it might be an idea for future missions to head into a near polar orbit. We do, of course, want to be exploring the lunar poles, and it does offer us the opportunity of using Skylab as a lifeboat if something does go wrong on these missions. They do still have pretty fine delta V margins in certain parts of the mission. So you can see this part, we only have 60 meters per second or so left on our return to Earth. There is still room for engine failures and things to go wrong and for a crew to get stranded out here. So although we would probably rather die than do it, we do have the option of asking the Americans to use Skylab as a lifeboat if something would go wrong on a future mission. But really, that just exemplifies the need for us to build our own lunar space station, which is definitely going to be the first payload for our UR700, which I am still yet to design. But we have the engines and all the parts we need to build it. We literally just need to design, tool, and build the damn thing. But after a few days of cruising, our motley crew are headed back to the Earth, and they're aiming for a splashdown in the Indian Ocean, same as Soyuz 13 earlier in the episode, because, well, it's a big target you can't really miss. Trying to land in the Soviet Union from a lunar orbit and the heavily inclined orbit you need to achieve that, the reason why Rodina 6 almost burnt up on re-entry, because of course the atmosphere moves with the rotation of the Earth. If you re-enter the atmosphere aligned with the direction the Earth is rotating, you actually massively reduce the relative velocity and your re-entry speed. And considering quite how close the margins are on the Soyuz capsule, you can see we actually use all the ablator here, and we more than used all the ablator on Rodina 6, much to my terror during that live stream. We want to make our re-entry as gentle as possible, but not too gentle. Some people think that you can just re-enter at a higher altitude, reduce the G-force and the peak heating, and make the re-entry easier. Yes, that does reduce the max deceleration and the peak heating you experience. That's the maximum temperature. On that heat shield you'll see the overheat meter in the bottom left there, which we did flirt with about sort of 90% mark as we came in for our first phase of the re-entry, this being a skip re-entry with 2 phases. But if you have a longer re-entry, you actually increase the total heat flux, which then means you run out of ablator. So there's a very fine balance between descending steep enough that you decelerate quickly and you don't burn through all of your ablator, but also not so steep that the peak Gs turn your crew into goop or you melt the heat shield. But no such terrible fate befalls our crew, and they splash down safely in the Indian Ocean as we complete our crewed targeted moon landing contract. However, we are quickly upstaged by the United States of America as the crew of Trinity 7 become the first Kerbals to visit their Skylab station around the moon. Leonid Kerman sees this as a grave embarrassment and a demonstration for the whole world that the US lunar program is much closer than the Soviet Union to placing boots on the moon permanently. The development of the UR-700 and Salyut 7 lunar space station are placed as a top priority. And I will be designing that UR-700 in a live stream this Friday, so look forward to that. I'll see you then. Thank you for watching, everyone. I do hope you've enjoyed. I've been the Beardy Penguin, and I'll see you all next time. A massive thank you to my patrons for their generous support, and an extra special thank you to The Amazing Steak, Dakota Clark, Madzor, Petulus Tinnets, Simone67, Scott Milligan, Lady Lagsalot, Jesse Smith, Olaf Hammerhand, NX74656, Jordan Millwood, Luna Nicole the Fox, Frosty Moon, Mr. Blue Star, Hendrick, Con of Class, F22 Raptor, and Paul Minis Nepeta.